More than 130 world leaders just completed a week of meetings in New York for the annual opening of the United Nations General Assembly. The High-Level Week, as it's called, began with states adopting UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres' Pact of the Future, a key document generated as part of the Summit of the Future. The goal of the summit and the Pact is to recharge the idea of global cooperation, which is facing severe strain and competition between the United States and its allies on the one hand, and Russia and China and their allies on the other. The UN meetings also occurred as conflicts in Ukraine, the Middle East, Sudan, and Myanmar, to name just a few, are killing tens of thousands of people and displacing millions. What are the key outcomes from the Summit of the Future, and how might it shape future global diplomacy? And how can the UN more broadly remain relevant amid such geopolitical tensions? This is the Just Security Podcast. I'm your host, Paresh Shah. Co-hosting with me today is Just Security's Washington senior editor, Viola Ganger. Joining the show to assess the High-Level Week and the Summit of the Future is Richard Ponzio. Richard is a senior fellow and director of the Stimson Center's program on global governance, justice, and security. Richard, thanks so much for joining the show. We're so excited to have you here and to share your expertise as we recap the latest edition of the UN General Assembly.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to participate in this discussion with Just Security.
So I want to get started by talking about the negotiations on UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres' Pact for the Future, which apparently was quite contentious. The negotiations ran right down to the wire. What turned out to be the main points of disagreement among states, and what do you think will be the impact of the final document?
Thank you. To start, the Antonio Guterres-led initiative through his Our Common Agenda has resulted in a consensus-based document from 193 UN member states. This Pact for the Future, the chief outcome, two associated instruments that I'm sure we'll talk about in greater detail today, the Global Digital Compact and Declaration on Future Generation, were also two important outcomes. And, it was not a given, including, I think we'll talk about some of the 11th hour theatrics involving Russia and a group called the Like-Minded Group of Member States, who really sought to thwart and undermine and erode the outcome and possibly not even allow us to get across the finish line a week ago in New York on the 22nd and 23rd of September. So the backdrop was that, it wasn't a given that there was going to be over 130 heads of state that came together in New York to reinvigorate global cooperation. The stated aims were threefold: to rebuild trust in and address gaps in global governance, to reaffirm both the charter and major instruments that this process was intimately seeking to reinforce, namely the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Paris Climate Agreement. But I think it's the third area that caught most of our attention, renewing the multilateral system. A lot of the ideas in what's called Chapter 5, transforming global governance, institutional change, other kinds of innovative approaches and tools to global governance. That was really quite what is new alongside these two instruments, the Global Digital Compact and the Declaration on Future Generations. I know in our discussion today we'll get into the geopolitical context, the backdrop, but that rebuilding trust, it is so hard to say with a straight face that, we use the summit has made headway, because during the event we saw the escalation of the conflict in the Middle East, not only the continuation in Gaza with Israel, but the inflammation of the fighting culminating in the assassination of the leader of Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. Nobody knows where this is going. It would bring in Iran, the United States, other major powers. Quite a conflagration to juxtapose against this really otherwise historic, I wouldn't say historic, but significant milestone meeting that the Summit of the Future represented. Reaffirming, though, all kinds of past commitments. The one that the Global South developing countries will look at the most, though, hey, you've made commitments again and again on financing for development, on climate financing over the past 10, 15 years, but we haven't seen that materialize. The debt problem, including thanks to the pandemic, but there were problems there before the pandemic, have only grown in recent years. The shortfalls to delivering on the 2030 agenda are astronomical, according to the UN's own studies, $2.5 to $4 trillion. Local domestic financing coupled with foreign aid. But it's this third category where I think we have a lot to build upon, because there were 56 actions and associated commitments agreed to in the Pact for the Future, and there were equally a number of important actions and commitments in the two other instruments. And those are areas that I think we have now momentum to build upon, not only working within the constraints of the current system and following the letter of the agreements, but using it as a springboard to more ambitious ideas that don't even fall into the current documents. I think if the trajectory is one of change, renewal, modernization, governments are sovereign and they can determine, hey, we didn't go quite far enough in the year 2024, and with an eye to the next UN Secretary General selection in 2026, starting in 2027, there could be a whole new ballgame that emerges as a result of, as I said a minute ago, this significant milestone that the international community has just achieved.
So you do think there's going to be a tangible effect as a result of this document that was finally agreed?
Absolutely. And I would love to explore with you today, chapter by chapter, where I think some of the big ticket, high impact global governance innovations are. Some of them are quite buried beneath the radar because the nature of multilateral diplomacy. If they only reaffirm past commitments, then I think the whole process would be exposed, and there would be questions about what was all the time, effort, consultations. There were, to the credit of the UN and the key co-facilitators from Germany and Namibia for the main Pact for the Future, but also the Jamaican and Dutch governments for the Declaration on Future Generations, and Sweden and Zambia for the Global Digital Compact. The outreach and ideas that fed into this process were unprecedented in many ways. We haven't seen on such a scale, maybe comparable to the 2030 post 2015 development agenda in that period, 2012 to 2015. But the fact is, this is a whole set of issues about changes in the international system, upgrading the machinery, and we can go chapter by chapter now across these 56 actions and even explore detailed commitments within those actions that are at least creating hope and a key message today, putting wind in the sails of at least a dozen, probably more, different committees and processes. Some exist, the Intergovernmental Negotiations on Security Council Reform, or the Ad Hoc Working Group on GA Revitalization, the General Assembly. These have been around for years, but they're now going to have new impetus. Not since the 1960s have we seen ambitious language now adopted by more than 130 heads of state. Other countries have signed on as well to reconfigure and upgrade the Security Council, representing today's geopolitical realities, even curbing the use or misuse of the veto power. The same can be said across the other major organs of the UN. The General Assembly could initiate its own resolutions to bring about some of the new innovations and changes on instruments where they don't exist or there needs to be new processes. And finally, the Global Digital Compact and Declaration on Future Generation, they have their own review processes coming. And it's through those review processes, through the Secretary General's careful analysis of progress since this last week's summit, and then when the member states convene again to assess what steps have been taken, both within countries, but most importantly, collectively across the international system. That's when we're going to see the rubber hitting the road. The real measure of success won't begin for at least another year, but in UN multilateral terms, that's a very short amount of time. And it's about holding governments accountable now to advance progress in very tangible ways.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned a lot of processes that will unfold from this, but concretely, what is perhaps the most surprising concrete outcome that is likely to result from this? Just one. What would be the most surprising result that people may see from this, in your estimation?
Yeah, and while I think there are some bigger ticket structural changes that really aren't talked about in the Pact for the Future, but could be catalyzed as a result down the road in terms of what is holding to the letter and the spirit of what was agreed upon. I know we're going to turn later to the Global Digital Compact, and there are a few governance innovations there, a really important discussion because too few countries are even involved in artificial intelligence, let alone cyber governance issues. But I would like to highlight what speaks to the far majority of countries, the developing world. The G77 is the group of how they organize themselves on questions, especially around financing for development, a term that was mentioned more than two dozen times in the document, SDGs financing and the broader financing for development and climate finance agenda. But in more concrete terms, actions 48 through 52, 6 concrete set of actions on all aspects of international financial architecture reform. This is speaking as, and it's unheard of for a UN document. Never in the history of UN reform efforts have we seen this level of detail and this much reference to the World Bank, the IMF, the so-called international financial institutions, also multilateral development banks, references to the World Trade System. Although the language about the G20 has been lifted and taken out, at least was in the spirit of the conversation these last 2 years. And everybody knows the powerful informal grouping of states known as the G20 and bringing them closer. Specifically in Action 48, I'll read to you the language that seems innocuous and not too detailed, to put it mildly, but it has the potential to be the vehicle for driving these concrete 6 actions and ensuring that new voices from the global south, from civil society, that are usually not part of these conversations of reforming the international financial architecture will be able to drive change. That's the notion of a biennial summit at the heads of state and government level to strengthen existing and establishing more systemic links in coordination between the UN and the international financial institutions. And we stress the need for inclusive participation. It's seemingly something people could skim over. What is this biennial summit? But go back to the originating document of this whole process, the Our Common Agenda, in September of 2021 by Secretary General Antonio Guterres. And he writes at length about this biennial summit of the global economy, bringing the G20, bringing the IFIs together. If it's taken to its logical conclusion, and this is the same for so many of the actions, we could set up, even informally at the beginning, but some kind of network secretariat to prepare for the agenda every 2 years when the General Assembly takes place. This will be an incentive for the most powerful governments on the planet to have their head of state or head of government represented in New York. That's no small feat. In recent years, only 4 out of 5 of the P5, the permanent members of the Security Council, were showing up. Major countries like Germany, led by Chancellor Merkel, would only come very infrequently over her 16 years as the head of state of her country. This will give an incentive to engage on the toughest issues of the day where their countries have the most clout. These discussions have been taking place outside and separate from the UN. So if we're really serious about building a more coherent global economic governance system that's synced up with environmental and social issues, mechanisms and innovations, I would call, like the Biennial Summit on the Global Economy, are an important step in that direction. There are other examples dealing with responses to food insecurity, energy insecurity, lots of lessons coming out of the pandemic of recent years, and would love to address those. But section by section of the report, action by action, there are a number of gems, what we call high-impact global governance innovations, that if there is serious follow-through just in these next 12 months, then we can point to the fact that this significant milestone that I referred to, of the Summit of the Future, also represented a historic turning point in some ways, rather than a historic footnote that we're going to quickly forget.
But as an outsider looking at this, it still sounds like a lot of process and, creating yet another UN institution of some sort, another UN office. Does this really signal something, a concrete takeaway in the near future? And I know near future is long term in UN terms, but Just, I think a lot of UN skeptics obviously would question the idea of more process and more meetings and more, institutions to do this, that, and the other. And the question is, what concretely changes?
What concretely changes? You take the overarching agreement for Paris from 2015, the important climate agreement, and indeed, we see overall the world has moved from a path towards 4.3 degrees Celsius warming of the planet to somewhere in the 2.5 to 2.7 degree range. But the scientists, through the International Panel on Climate Change, have warned repeatedly that we have to take seriously a heating up of the planet no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius since the start of the Industrial Revolution over 200 years ago. So yes, governments can make agreements, but there's so much into the structural transformation of our economies that are required. And so many of the countries that weren't even the main emitters that contributed to global warming, they're on the front lines. They're most vulnerable, low-lying countries, small island, developing states. And so issues around climate finance, mitigation and adaptation to prepare and ensure that these newly developing countries, the BRICS in the global south, other emerging economies, are developing ways that are not harmful for the climate, and we're not exacerbating the problem and moving to green energy. That requires a whole different system of global governance. Yes, it's far more than just aid transfers, it's technology, it's new types of international cooperation, and that indeed, this is just one mega example, I would say, as far as global collective action problems, climate and related planetary boundary, environmental governance challenges are the most obvious global collective action dilemmas. But whether it's on how we're dealing with weapons of mass destruction and violence and terrorism and fragile conflict-affected states, or a whole range of issues around artificial intelligence and cyber tech governance, all of these issues need a United Nations that is competent and capable and able to be a bridge between those with knowledge and technical and financial resources and know-how and those who can offer capacity. So the UN is much more than just convening member states. It's much more than the sum of its international civil servants operating through various agencies, programs, and funds. It's now a convener of private sector partners, civil society, NGOs who can be implementing programs, especially in the development and humanitarian space, but mobilizing for change. Social movements feel attached to and part of the United Nations. That's been the big transformation in global governance, which the Pact for the Future and the other instruments absolutely represent. But to give you, since you're looking for more concrete details and why they matter, artificial intelligence has come on strong just in the last 2 years in the UN discussions, thanks to the Global Digital Compact. It wasn't even a core chapter until everybody's attention turning to these powerful tools where risk mitigation and preventing autonomous weapons and public bads emerging where we can't control the power of these technologies is as big a concern about harnessing AI for good and being part of addressing the major development challenges of this time. And while we're not ready as an international community to take a leap towards new bodies, some discussions that we've been writing about learning from the International Atomic Energy Agency and how that was the beginning of the nuclear age and how we needed to get a control on that in connection with the Cold War at the time. We may, at some not so distant future, need to be thinking along those lines. But as far as important first steps, I referred to the International Panel on Climate Change, bringing the best scientists, people from industry who can work on green tech. The same arguments hold now, and there's an agreement in the Global Digital Compact for a scientific panel to emerge just in the next 12 months. So you're going to see progress, and having those scientific best and the brightest minds advising policymakers on next steps, that is a fundamental and critical first step. And then it gets to the main point, which is in a study through the Secretary General's new AI, Artificial Intelligence Advisory Body, they mapped out that there are 7 major new initiatives just in the last few years on AI governance. The 7 most powerful countries where many of the tech companies reside have participated and are driving and leading those there are over 118 plus countries that do not participate in any of these fora. That brings together what the UN is all about. The only universal membership body, 193 member states. It ensures that these bridges between the global south, global north, many bridges within different groupings of states that need to be overcome just to have a voice. There's going to be this new forum called a Global Dialogue on Artificial Intelligence. That at least is going to begin to rectify who is at the table and participating in decision making. Otherwise, a subject that I'm sure we're going to turn to soon, the Security Council reform, the dominance by the permanent 5 members over 75 years. This is critical that we prevent the same mistakes of the past in the peace and security space to this very critical area on AI and cyber governance.
That's great. Thank you. And thanks very much for touching on that Global Digital Compact as well. Thank you.
Yeah, and shifting gears slightly, in the run-up to High Level Week, much of the discussion in diplomatic circles and in foreign policy circles was around the conflicts in the Middle East between Israel, Hezbollah, and Hamas, and the war in Ukraine. And there was a sense that in a way, those conflicts might overshadow UNGA, or at least inform the discussion and how many states in the global south and the global north are framing their diplomatic points. What ended up happening in terms of discussion on those conflicts? Was there any movement on them, particularly given the continued paralysis in the Security Council?
On one hand, it's remarkable once again that there was consensus achieved around the Pact for the Future and the associated documents. Given the conflicts that you just referred to, there's all kinds of reasons why governments don't trust each other and would not meet. And let's just take Ukraine on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly to talk openly. It was always spilling into the press of whether Ukraine could use Western supplied weapons to tack further into Russia, and the worry that problem, the war would spread and bring NATO into the conflict more directly. The same worries in a different setting, the Middle East, were at the forefront because of the escalation of fighting between Israel and southern Lebanon-based Hezbollah movement, and worries now of bringing Iran into the conflict. And you could say so. Two things. One is it's incredible that against that more than challenging backdrop that such instruments were adopted. But that the UN was providing its first and foremost role since its creation in 1945, a peacemaking organization, a place for dialogue, wanting diplomacy to dictate how wars will end. Not all, some wars end through military conflict, but the far, far majority, as we see in studies for decades now, as a negotiated settlement is necessary. And the UN, first and foremost, is a peacemaking supporting organization, and it showed its utility in that regard. As it relates, though, to specific outcomes in the summit and where it could lead to new innovations in its fundamental peacemaking, but related conflict prevention, peacekeeping, and post-conflict peace-building roles, I refer you to both Chapter 2 on a whole dedicated chapter around international peace and security, and a few really important set of ideas on Security Council reform in actions 39 through 41, 3 major, very detailed sets of actions in that final concluding transforming global governance chapter. Also a full action dealing with peace-building commission and the related peace-building support office and fund architecture, as it's called, peace-building architecture reform, which, by the way, will be followed up immediately by a major peace-building architecture review meeting in 2025, and that's a good example of that momentum won't be lost, but rather specific areas such as the Peace-Building Commission and its upgrade and strengthening its utility, maybe learning from the Human Rights Commission and how it was transformed at a similar summit in 2005 and had new tools such as the Universal Periodic Review to enhance its safeguarding and promotion of human rights role. We could see something similar happen in the not-so-distant future related to the PBC. But a final point is that one of the reasons that the Chapter 2 on international peace and security is so detailed compared to even the other chapters, very concrete sets of actions, in areas such as the next generation of women, peace and security, and youth peace and security engagement, concrete actions on a top priority of the Secretary General since the beginning of his tenure in 2017, the area of prevention and focusing on a surge in diplomacy to address many of the festering conflicts today, especially within countries, but often internationalized by the engagement of outside actors. The fact is there was a new agenda for peace, a very important document that was upgraded after 30 years, the original one, 1992, by Boutros Boutros-Ghali, then the Secretary General. And I would say that in connection with these conflicts today from the Middle East to Ukraine, but especially forgotten conflicts that don't get the attention among great powers, your Sudans, the continued problem in eastern DRC, and Haiti in the Western Hemisphere. This is the UN's forte.
Yeah, we did want to ask you a little bit about Haiti, as a matter of fact. There has been a little bit of confusion of which direction the United States wanted to go on this. In the lead up to High Level Week, there was talk about the U.S. supporting a transition of the police mission in Haiti that is led by Kenya currently and is financed primarily by the United States and was sanctioned by the Security Council, but is not under the UN umbrella. Now there is talk that the U.S., in fact, is now backing off of that position and is supporting an extension of the existing structure. Is that how you understand it? Can you just give us a brief state of play on that debate?
Great. No, I've been following Haiti since the discussions, especially really began to heat up last year in 2023. And great to see an African country, Kenya, step up and offer its police forcing to lead, along with a few Caribbean neighboring countries of Haiti. What was astonishing is that the UN structure through the Department of Peace Operations was, for the most part, bypassed. And I can see the grumblings now and concerns by not only the U.S. government as a whole, but especially the Department of Defense, which has been asked to play a logistical support and channel direct financing to the police the same way that the Department of Peace Operations would offer those types of services to the national contingents, whether military or police, for blue helmet operations in a peacekeeping environment, an area that the UN has tremendous expertise. Now, in the case of Haiti and why things have played out the way they have, it has so much to do with the very sad and horrific challenges that the UN has faced in the case of Haiti, from spreading of cholera to sexual exploitation and abuse. Nobody can discount, and the UN has taken measures across the board over recent years to prevent those episodes from happening again. My biggest concern is throwing out the baby with the bathwater. That's such an important conflict management tool, one instrument that the UN, more than any other, pioneered since the 1950s when peacekeeping was first introduced, will be forgotten and bypassed. And this is no joke, because for over a decade there hasn't been a new peacekeeping mission. There's pressure for the UN to retire existing ones. And yet we see the need is growing in certain parts of the world, Exhibit A being Haiti. And there were at least 4 different generations of the U.S. engagement in Haiti. One high point was the last time President Lula was leading his country of Brazil, and the Brazilians led the force commander role. And that, in particular, was seen as a period of stability and hope and promise. So leadership matters, from the national contingents to the backstopping support role of the UN. The special representative, the Secretary General, leads on the mediation and working through these conflicts so that it's much more than just ensuring a ceasefire and some degree of stability, but actually getting on the road to longer term, what is often required, structural change of a political and economic nature. Those are the seeds. This is why we have terms like peace building and sustaining peace. It's so much more than preventing violent conflict, a negative view of peace, but one that is dealing with issues of governance, rule of law, economic, social, even environmental aspects contribute to stability in society. This is what the UN and these multidimensional peace operations have been designed to undertake. And while we can't discount, again, failures and mistakes that have been made, people should be brought to justice when they have made grave errors that tarnish the reputation of the UN, to completely replace it with new coalitions of the willing and efforts that, in the end, the major donor countries like the United States will have to backstop and pay for anyways. Why not fix and innovate and strengthen the system that has been around for several decades?
Thank you. And just to clarify what happened with the cholera and the sexual abuse, that was actually found to have been the UN UN members of the UN contingent that inadvertently brought cholera to Haiti, and in the case of the sexual exploitation and abuse, that was found to have been committed by the UN forces there. But as you say, there have been so many other contexts where UN forces have been very, very effective and potentially perhaps could be again in Haiti. Thank you very much. Appreciate that perspective on that.
Thank you. No, and at my own time, the UN's operation in Sierra Leone, first and foremost, the blue flag, the blue helmets are seen as a source of hope, inspiration, confidence building in countries where very few, even neighboring countries, would want to step in. Or when they did, there was a regional ECOWAS, West African force. They committed heinous crimes and had to be replaced by the UN-led Blue Beret. With that point said, I think going in the direction of joint African Union in the UN, or even regional bodies working with the UN, there are definite advantages, and it has been tested out in one or two places in East Africa, in Sudan in recent years. So there's some important lessons there.
Thanks so much for that. And we're running short on time, but do you have a final thought as we conclude the episode?
Great. No, I'm glad. And then it gives me a chance to turn to Security Council reform, because in one sense, it is signaled, as I said, in three key actions, 39, 40, and 41. It came out of this body that now will have new momentum, the intergovernmental negotiations on Security Council reform. The fact, though, that there was concrete language that Africa has been served a historical injustice, and that regions such as the Asia Pacific and Latin America are underrepresented. The fact that it speaks to needing to modify and avoid the misuse and abuse of the veto power of the Permanent Five in very clear language. The fact that it talks about working towards one consolidated model. This is what we've all been waiting for, to at least have text through the IGM. It sounds extraordinary that they haven't gotten to this stage since these debates really reemerged again in a big way at the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s. But we are where we are. We know the historical reasons why real progress beyond something called working methods, procedural issues have really been lacking. And so to have wind in the sails of this body, a clear direction, to know that the General Assembly is watching very closely what happens there and is ready to step in if we see continued paralysis of the Security Council. There's been something called the Uniting for Peace resolution since the Korean War in the early 1950s, and it's been innovated in different ways since then. But most recently, the Liechtenstein Initiative, which forces countries to defend a veto vote made in the Security Council. We've seen it now multiple times where China and Russia have had to defend vetoes on issues involving North Korea, even though there had been consensus among the great powers since the early 2000s. Of course, on the Ukraine conflict, but even the United States with Israel over the last 12 months. It's really important to think about peace and security being a shared responsibility. The peace-building architecture was created in 2005, partly because of the failure of the Security Council to be fully proficient in fulfilling its mandate for the promotion, safeguarding international peace and security. So if the UN Security Council is not reformed and changed, you can expect and continue to see innovations elsewhere, maybe the role of the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court that exists. So there are a number of steps that will require amendments to the Charter. That's something that did not come up in the Pact for the Future negotiations, but it's time to demystify this idea. We can't possibly get agreement, and you have to bring in national legislatures to amend the Charter. This is exactly what the framers of the Charter knew back in 1945. President Truman, the U.S. president at the time, called it an imperfect document, but an important step, and we have to be ready to upgrade and modernize it over time, beginning with this most critical body for enacting international law and fulfilling its collective security role, the UN Security Council. If we don't get that right, it really ties the hands of the United Nations in other critical areas where it needs to be performing well. But first and foremost, it was established to prevent a third world war, to be a peacemaking organization. The fact that it still exists is an important step, but something we should never be satisfied with. We need to keep it relevant to both current, and what was great about this last week's summit was the focus on future generations. Might be several generations from now that could be benefiting from decisions that are made today and getting us on the right track. Certainly, the UN, including its charter, will need to be upgraded over time. This is a responsibility, I would argue, of every generation. But it's really important learning from these conflicts that are going on currently, learning from the biggest arguable global governance challenge of our time, climate change, that we're not there yet in terms of having the capabilities and the ability to execute the vision and the agreements by political leaders in 2015 at the Paris Climate Agreement. We're not there in delivering on this agenda because it has something to do with not having the right governance structures in place. And this is the important step that was taken a week ago. There's a lot of work to build upon it. And I certainly hope that people, individual citizens, working in concert with their civil society organizations, the private sector, and then, of course, the governments that represent them, are going to continue to take seriously this type of agenda because it's going to require many years of serious concerted effort ahead. Thank you.
Thanks again, Richard. Thank you so much for joining the show and sharing your insights and analysis with us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
This episode was co-hosted and produced by me, Paresh Shah, and Viola Ganger, with help from Clara Apt. Special thanks to Richard Ponzio. You can read all of Just Security's coverage of the UN General Assembly and the Summit of the Future, including Richard's analysis, on our website. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.